In this video, we're going to talk about Boolean values. So Boolean values are in almost every language I've ever seen. Um, and actually, not almost, they are in every language I've ever seen. So they are useful for just identifying when a condition of true or false. And you can see that actually expressions like, is it true that 5 equals 5, does evaluate into a Boolean value. They just become that. Now you can actually type out the Boolean value itself. It is a data type, but the data type basically has two choices. It's either true or false. So if you wanted to, you could actually represent that by just typing in the word true. Let me see if I can explain that a little bit better. So let's say I go through and I type out a variable and I put an integer in there. Now I print out its type using the type function. And I run it and I can see that's an integer. Notice that it says class. We talked about class in the last video. Integer is a built-in class. If I put in a couple quotes around it, it becomes a string. If on the other hand I put in the word true, it's a data type and it becomes a Boolean. And this is a possible value in a Boolean data type. Just like 1 is a possible value in an integer and 1.3 is a possible value in a float. False, of course, equals false, and true, of course, equals true. But in general, most languages allow you to go ahead and do some tricky stuff with using numbers or characters when you're evaluating a Boolean expression. So, for example, if I use a number, if it's true that 1, the code doesn't look like it means anything. But oddly enough, it evaluates a true. Strange, huh? If you put in a 0, it evaluates a false. In many languages, if you put in a 2 or a 3, it doesn't work. In other languages, anything other than 0 works as being true. That's true. That's the case in Python. What happens if you put character data in? True. What happens if you put no characters but a couple empty strings? False. Strange, huh? So the deal is, this is another one of those little gotchas in the programming world. Some people will, when they write out basic demo code, etc., they'll just do a shortcut like this, where they'll put a 0 in there to force it to be false, or maybe they'll put an empty string to force it to be false. And when you see that, that's all that's going on. There are some variations that you should know about. Let's say I would go ahead and make that variable like this, and I put in input. Okay, let's see what we get here. Put in a 1. True. Okay, let's put in a 0. True. What? Well, that's because it's being evaluated as a string. So let's convert over to integer and let's see what happens. False. Now it's being evaluated as an integer. And let's take that off again and run it one more time. And this time I'm not going to type anything in. I'm going to hit enter. Oops, wrong pane. Enter, and it comes out as false. That's because it's an empty string. So there's no data in there. I just hit enter and it came back as false. We saw that empty strings do that. It's another place to kind of test things out. So, and you have to keep in mind when you're doing these comparisons like this that if you're looking at a Boolean value, or excuse me, let's say you go through here and you examine whether or not 100 is equal to 100. Well, that is true, but since 0 equals false, is it true equals false? It'll be false. Okay, what if I go through and I say, is it that true equals 1? Now notice I got parentheses around here, so it's going to evaluate this as either true or false. And it is true that true equals 1, which seems kind of weird, but we know that 1 is the equivalent of true in Python. What if you do something like this, though? We saw that 2 was the equivalent of true earlier. But if you do something a little bit more complex, like this, what's going to happen? Oh boy. Now, when you're copying and pasting off of these things, Microsoft Word often will give you invisible characters that you can't see. It is a problem, so I'll clean out those invisible characters. And hopefully that should resolve it. Non-Unicode starting at line 4, huh? Where are you? That's your problem with invisible. You happy now? There we go. No, it wasn't the fact that it had spaces, it was the fact that one of the spaces was interpreted by Word as some weird character that you couldn't tell. Okay, you can see that it comes out as false in this case. And that's because if you ask the question, is 2 equal to true? That's not true. If you ask the question, is true equal to 1? That is true. But if you ask the question, is 2? That's also true. Now that's inconsistent. It seems bizarre, but it's what it is. So once again, it's back to if in doubt, test it out. You can also put a variable set to none as kind of a placeholder that you haven't assigned it to anything yet. None is equivalent to null in other languages. So if I were to go through and say int x, right now it's set to 100. 100 evaluates it true because it's all on its own. And if I set it to null or none in this language, hasn't been assigned a value yet, then it gets set to false. I know it's a lot to remember, but the thing is that as time goes on, you'll mess with it and you'll get the hang of it in no time. Just be patient with yourself. Everybody goes through this. It seems like a lot to memorize, but you don't have to memorize it. You just have to remember that it does weird things and you have to test your work. Usually when I'm writing code, I'll have a couple of files open. Like I'll have one open for just testing purposes and another file open for what I'm working on. And that way I can switch between them. I can type in my real code over here, and then if I want to test an idea out, I just come over to my test one and type some code, verify that it's going to work the way I think, and then come back to my work file and put stuff in. Okay, that hopefully gives you an understanding of the Boolean values and how they're used. And I'll see you in the next one. Next one is loops. Well, I'll see you there.